Hello! Today we're going to have a little bit of an introduction to the reading assignment that you previewed last night. It is The Course in General Linguistics by Ferdinand deSaussure. I want to share a little bit of information about the topics that you're going to encounter so that as you read the text thoroughly, you will be able to sort of catch on to the main ideas of the argument. Some of you might be already familiar with reading these kinds of technical, theoretical texts. But for others, it is really challenging to get into the process of reading something that is, first of all, difficult and second of all, long. So hopefully this overview will help you as you start to jump into tackling this argument about language meaning. So let's open our text to the first page of chapter 1. We see that part 1 is deSaussure's general principles about linguistics. Chapter 1, so the very first thing he wants to tell us about is the nature of the linguistic sign. So the characteristics about how linguistic sign works. And part 1, the subtitle is Sign, Signified, Signifier. So these are the three key words of part 1 of this text. So we see right away we have a picture of a tree, a picture of a horse. These are probably signs. And then at the bottom of the page, the author makes his first real claim. He's talking about the associative bond or the association within language. I know a lot of us are probably familiar with the associative property in math. So I don't know if this is similar to that, but what he means is that psychologically, language meaning happens because we form an association between a word and a concept. That's the associative bond. Turning to the next page, page 66, we have this talk about sound image. And that, to me personally, that is a odd thing to try and wrap your head around. Why would you say sound image instead of word? And in the argument, he specifies that he's trying to provide a fresh vocabulary for talking about language and meaning. So instead of using the term word, he wants to make up his own word. So he uses sound image. And he thinks of that as the sensible and perceivable property of language. So the word that you actually hear with your ears or you see with your eyes. So sound image, he's trying to capture the sensational aspect of language. And then he provides a little bit of a diagram. Looking at the next page, page 67, at the top he makes this claim that seems like he's saying language habits determine what you see as reality, or your view of reality determines the way you use language. So he's getting into that theory of linguistic determinism a little bit. A little bit in the middle of the page after this diagram, he gives us his 3 technical terms. So the title of this section is called Sign, Signifier, Signified. And for deSaussure, his word sign is equal to the combination of signifier, which is that sound image, and signified, which is the concept or the meaning behind the sound image. So it's an important kind of trifecta. You have the sign, which is the entire bundle of meaning making. And inside that bundle is the concept and the sound image. And he says again in his argument that the reason for making up these three terms is to try and overcome some of the ambiguity about theories and technical works which try to explore linguistic meaning. After that, we move from section 1 to section 2. The title of section 2 is Principle 1, the arbitrary nature of language. So turning over to page 68, we start to get into his argument about the arbitrary nature of language. You might remember some of these ideas from the lesson that we viewed last class. I'd like to point out in the first paragraph on page 68, deSaussure is telling us a little bit of the context for his argument, and he says no one disputes that language is arbitrary. So he's putting us into a sort of ongoing conversation or an ongoing thought process regarding language meaning, and he's saying nobody disputes that it's arbitrary. And then he tries to look at different types of language, not just a word, like a written or spoken word. And he brings up these counterpoints and says, let's see if these things, first of all, if they count as language, and second of all, if they follow this arbitrary principle. This is kind of a critical writing technique, which is to support your argument by predicting counterclaims and then like proactively addressing them and refuting them. So it's kind of a move where you say, this is what I think. I can understand why other people might disagree or other people might think differently. And this is how I would respond to that. So those counterpoints that he's predicting are gesture. So he looks at, does gesture count as language? Does it follow the arbitrary nature? Symbols, onomatopoeia, and interjections. So that's page 68 and 69. Flipping over to page 70, we have the final point that deSaussure is making in chapter 1, and he talks about principle number 2, the linear nature of the signifier. And this is a short section, but it is kind of confusing. So the linear nature of the signifier, remember the signifier is the word or the symbol or the image. It's the part that carries the meaning. And he's saying it has to happen in order. So beginning, middle, and end. We might link this to what we learned last class about syntax or word order or grammar. So language can only have meaning if it takes place in order. Okay. Chapter 2. So we're going to move on to page 71. Chapter 2 is immutability and mutability of the sign. So right away it clues us in that there's going to be two sides to the argument that we're about to see. They seem to be opposite. Immutability seems to be the opposite of mutability. So we'll keep our eyes peeled for, it looks like two opposite arguments. Part 1. Immutability. So just based on the word meaning, it's saying that language meaning cannot be muted. We might say maybe it means it cannot be silenced or turned off. But really what the point of this section is, deSaussure is arguing that word meaning cannot be easily changed. So in a way it's fixed. The two paragraphs near the bottom of this page, most of the page is saying kind of like language is viewed as a social contract that takes place within history of the society. So language meaning is embedded with social codes and the whole history of that society. Turning the page to 72, He draws an analogy saying that language is like any other social institution. And I think he might give examples like religion and art and stuff. And then he asks this question, which is kind of using the conditional form of reasoning. He says, if language is like any kind of social institution, then we want to know, how are social institutions in general transmitted throughout the community and across history? So he wants to take his argument, his question of his research, from something very specific having to do with language and linguistics to something more broad and encompassing, like all social institutions. Looking over at page 73, we have him, let's go back. Back to 72, let's look all the way at the bottom. He has this great example of a transition sentence. He's telling us, I've just been talking about these important and broad questions. Now I'm going to switch over to some basic and direct questions. So he's transitioning from general to more specific. So from language as a social institution to language as language. And then the specific questions he has for language, which, has to do with the idea that language is immutable or unchangeable, are, he gives 4. He gives 4 sort of topics here. And as you read these topics, try and see if you can maybe challenge or refute these ideas. Often when we read an old text, so something like this, which is from, 1903, and we're living in 2020 already, so maybe our view of the way language works is different from his. So as we read these 4 points, let's see if we can think of any challenges or ways to refute them. First of all, he tells us again a reason to support his claim that language is immutable. He tells us again about the arbitrary nature of language. We can't change or overwrite language meaning because it's so arbitrary. Secondly, the multiplicity of signs. We can't change language because there's too many. There's too many signs, there's too many words, there's too many symbols. We can't revise them all. Number 3, the over complexity of the system. So we can't easily change language because it is bounded by the complex logic of grammar rules. Number 4, a collective inertia toward change. So this one is kind of a social critique. He's saying we can't change language because people don't generally like change. We like to keep it how it is. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Turning the page over to page 74. Here we get into the second topic that's listed in this chapter title, mutability. So if immutability is the idea that language meaning can't be changed, mutability is the idea that language meaning in fact can be changed. So whether we choose to view this chapter against the grain, which is kind of a critical reading method, we could say this author is contradicting himself. Or we can choose to read it with the grain, which is another kind of critical reading technique. We can say, okay, this author is offering a complex argument that has more than one view. So depending on your personal style, you can choose to say, this is a faulty argument because he contradicts himself, or you can say, this is a really great argument because he provides a complexity. Anyways, let's get into this part 2. I see some bold and some underlined here. And he starts off just launching right into this paradox of this section. He says change is based on continuity. So we have, language can't be changed. Language can be changed. Change is based on continuity. It's starting to get a little bit confusing in here. looking over at page 75, we see this key idea about the shifting bonds between the signifier and the signified. So if we remember back to chapter 1, one of the key points was that the way language meaning happens is we form associative bonds between words and meaning. And now we're here at the sort of the back of chapter 2, and he's saying that language meaning changes because those bonds shift. So the bond between the signifier and the signified shifts sometimes. And then he supports that claim with some examples from etymology, which you might remember the keyword etymology from our last lesson means the history of word meaning, the history of how word meaning changes over time. At the bottom of page 75, the author links back to that previous idea that language is seen to be as a social institution. So he's comparing the way language changes to the way other social institutions change. Let's turn the page to 76, where we just see more supporting examples for that claim that language meaning is mutable, so it is changeable. Page 77, I see this sort of italic word a priori. It's sort of just a Latin word. It just means it's a given, or it's a fact, or it's accepted. So I don't think we'll see this term a priori in future readings for our class, but if you continue to study in the humanities and liberal arts, when you're reading technical or philosophical works, you might encounter that again. A priori just means it's given. This idea exists before we get into it. It's prior. Okay, and then he says that word, and then he makes this sort of contrast, continuity on one side and change on the other. So this theme is sort of overarching the whole section of mutability. And then at the end, he gives us a review. He says, all right, this is kind of nice of him. This is what we've been talking about for the past chapter. Number 1, I'm trying to be precise with my word meaning. He says he wants to avoid sterile word definitions. So he's making up his own words, and that's his justification behind it. And then number 2, language and meaning must include the social context. So in his diagram, he's linking language to the community of speakers, or what we call in language study, we sometimes call it the speech community. Turning to 78, he gives us another element on his review. He says, language is both fixed and changeable. So thanks for summing that up at the end. And he shows in his diagram by adding that image of time. Time changes that sort of agreement between language and the community. And then on this excerpt, there's a little bit from chapter 3, and we won't read that. So please, after you read this article, make sure that you are annotating it, taking notes on a separate piece of paper, and especially paying attention to areas of the text that don't make sense. And we will be able to discuss those at the beginning of next class.